This is the Dollemore Daily.
Yes, I'm not Jesse Dollemore. I'm Mike Greiner from the Democratic Activist channel that we'll link to down below, sitting in for Jesse while he's moving from California to D.C., since the news never stops. And here's an example of that. Just yesterday, a court in California convicted Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes of 4 counts of fraud. She could face up to 20 years in prison for each count. Now, Holmes had claimed that she was an innocent victim in this whole process. She, of course, had become a poster child for Silicon Valley with her Steve Jobs-like black outfits and her superior salespersonship. She excited investors and raised hundreds of millions of dollars for her company. The company was supposed to manufacture machines that were going to be able to take tiny bits of blood from you in your pharmacy and maybe even in your house and conduct a whole series of blood tests right then and there. So you wouldn't have to go to a lab and have them take your blood and then wait for results to come. It would all happen electronically on these miracle machines that Theranos was supposedly building. Now, the most amazing thing to me, reading all these descriptions of what she was accused of and what was going on in the case and the evidence that was presented against her, is how nobody stopped and said, wait a minute, could this be true? There's so many times when somebody had a signal that, you know what, this might not be a good investment, maybe I shouldn't go forward with it. And yet they all got caught up in the hype and decided to go forward because, of course, Elizabeth Holmes looked the part and she delivered a good story, which was enough for them to invest millions of dollars. What's more is most of these investors knew better and really could afford to lose the money. I mean, one of the big investors was Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education. Now, despite her definitely questionable tenure as Secretary of Education in the Trump administration, she and her husband built Amway into a global behemoth. So clearly they have some understanding of business and should have known what they were investing in before they invested $100 million. But in typical fashion, once a business fails, which of course most businesses fail, the investors want some kind of remedy. After all, they've lost money, they want something back. That's why in the United States we've got something called the business judgment rule, which essentially says that as long as the managers are behaving in good faith and are essentially acting based upon valuable information that they have, that they can't be held liable if it turns out the business goes south. So prosecutors had a high burden to overcome to be able to convict Elizabeth Holmes. What's more is they were charging her with fraud and misrepresentation, which in the United States requires at least 5 elements to be proven. They require, for example, that there be a statement of fact, not one of opinion, and statements that sound factual but are kind of bolstering the image of something with rhetoric. Those can't be counted as statements of fact. So if I were to say, this is the fastest car ever, that's not a statement of fact, even though it sounds that way. The statement of fact must be incorrect. The person must have known that was incorrect and that it was made with the intent to deceive the person. The party must have relied upon that information and reasonably relied upon it, and that they were harmed as a result of their reliance on this statement. Given that for criminal charges, all these things need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the prosecutor certainly had a heavy burden to overcome. Now, I've got to tell you, I was kind of surprised that they decided to prosecute Elizabeth Holmes in this case. Pretty much everything I've read about that she did was pretty much typical for Silicon Valley. It's not unusual for entrepreneurs to kind of boost up their businesses and make all kinds of representations, which might be on the borderline of being accurate. And Elizabeth Holmes wasn't alone. I mean, she was overseen by a board which included 2 former Secretaries of Defense, James Madison, William Perry, and 2 former Secretaries of State, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger. I mean, these are people who should have taken their role as overseers of the company and their role in corporate governance seriously. And the investors, in addition to Betsy DeVos, were unsophisticated investors like Rupert Murdoch and Larry Ellison of Oracle. I mean, these are people who should have known better and should have done their research before they invested millions. But I guess they viewed it as, hey, you know, they've got plenty of money to invest. It doesn't matter if they lose a few million here or a few million there. So why is it that she's being prosecuted while so many other Silicon Valley entrepreneurs get away with it? The biggest evidence that the prosecutors relied upon were examples of demonstrations of the product. Demonstrations which were allegedly faked. But yet in the movie Steve Jobs, we see an example when Steve Jobs is first announcing the Macintosh, and he wanted the Macintosh to say hello to the audience, something that its processors were incapable of doing at the time, that Jobs essentially went along with an effort to fake it, essentially put in a different processor than was the one that was going to be shipped with the computer. And yet nobody had any problems with that, despite the fact that Steve Jobs ended up being forced out of Apple, and Apple nearly went bankrupt. I know it's hard to believe those days, now with Apple being valued at $3 trillion. But at least with Apple, Jobs can say that, the company ultimately became successful. There are other executives who can't say that. I mean, we've got Adam Neumann, who is the head of WeWork. This is a company that essentially leased office space in downtown areas and then would essentially divide it up and lease small offices to individuals and small businesses. The company was growing so quickly based upon money that was invested on it, again, based upon Newman's personality and the good story that he was telling. The company never made a cent, lost billions. Ultimately, Neumann was fired, but rather than facing criminal prosecution like Elizabeth Holmes, he got a payout of $1.7 billion, with a B, billion dollars. And then let's talk about Travis Kalanick. I mean, all of us have used Uber, right? Seems like a great company. But the reality is very different. Behind the scenes, it turns out that Kalanick was running the company like some kind of bad fraternity from Animal House. Something that was rife with sexual harassment and bad behavior. And Uber continues to burn through investors' money like it's water, not coming anywhere near to making a profit. And Kalanick, of course, well, yeah, they took him out of the CEO role, but he's still on the board. So what's the difference between these Silicon Valley CEOs and Elizabeth Holmes? Well, they have penises. I think it's especially telling that Elizabeth Holmes had a partner and former boyfriend who worked with her at Theranos, who is also going to be facing charges. It'll be quite interesting to see what ends up coming of his trial, which is going to be occurring later this year. Sadly, Holmes made all kinds of claims that she didn't know what was going on, that she was abused by this individual, and frankly, I think the jury didn't believe her. And truth be told, neither did I. I think Elizabeth Holmes was a very good executive and a very smart woman who is behaving exactly the way that every other Silicon Valley CEO behaves as they try to raise money for their companies. The fact that she's being charged while these others are escaping really better than scot-free. I mean, I'd love to fail and get a $1.7 billion payout as a result of it. Well, it shows that the bro culture of Silicon Valley is alive and well. Right about now, I think Elizabeth Holmes is wishing she were born a man. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could check out my channel, Democratic Activist, we'll link to that down below. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.